So if you want to rewrite your Black Lives Matter response, I'm going to use the response from a student here to show you the things that she did and to show you how you can use it to compare it to your own. Okay. So I'm not going to read all of this, but I am going to point out some parts that are really well written. And then I'm going to point out some things that I noticed that this person could improve so that you don't think necessarily that this is a perfect answer, but that you can at least get an idea that this is an answer that gets all the points. Okay, so take a look at this. This answer was long. Okay, this person wrote all the way to 2 pages. Okay, but what I liked about this answer was that this person wrote in a lot of detail. Okay. Not to the point, though, that it was excessive. So here's what I mean. In this first paragraph, this student gives a lot of context, which is exactly what you had to do in this assignment. You had to tell me what happened before this picture and how did we get here to 2020 and to the protests that are happening for George Floyd. So this student not only talked about George Floyd in her first paragraph, but she also went ahead and talked about the civil rights movement. She talked about people like Rosa Parks. Okay, but notice that she doesn't just mention them. Look at how far she goes. The events that led to this Black Lives Matter protest in 2020 date all the way back to the segregation era, when African Americans had separate facilities from white people. It specifically starts after African Americans, like Rosa Parks and the Little Rock 9 boycott, and mixing their way into the era of the civil rights movement. And then she goes on to talk about people like Martin Luther King Jr., right? The Freedom Riders, and how they achieved stuff like the Voting Rights Act. This was all in your lesson. So if you're wondering where did she get all this information from? She likely got it from the lessons that we did before this one, okay? And then notice how she ties it all in. She says, however, decades later, America would be experiencing a new wave of change, more specifically after the death of Trayvon Martin. So she kind of ties it all into this era right now, okay? I would have liked to have seen a little more of a connection, like a little bit more of a tie-in, and maybe that could have been the theme of civil disobedience or the theme of human rights or the theme of civil rights, right? So some kind of string, an imaginary string that ties everything together, right? Now she goes on to her second paragraph where she talks about the people that you should know about in order to understand this picture better. And so she mentions people, but she also explains why they're important, which is something that I noticed in other answers. Yeah, a lot of people were mentioned, but you never connected why they were necessary. Right? So this student talks about them, and then she talks about specifically Colin Kaepernick, Eric Reed, and then she mentions individuals that were in lesson 2 of Black Lives Matter unit. So people that were on the table, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, etc. And she talks about them in the theme of police brutality and systemic racism. And so that's why she feels like you need to know about these people in order to understand this photo. Now, the last thing that I really liked about this was the reflection. So if you notice, there was a couple of questions where I asked you to think about what changed from when you saw this picture first to when you're writing about it now. And so she said some interesting reflections here. For example, as I learned about the purpose behind the protests and movements, I now understand that there's a connection between all the fights that African Americans have had to endure for decades. So she's thinking about this historically, not just in terms of July and June of 2020. Okay, this is a historical assignment after all. You are in a history class, so keep that in mind when you're writing yours. Okay, so this assignment is going to be posted there on Google Classroom along with this video. So I hope this was helpful to you.